Well, we're trying to build the literary agency of the future. After everything changed in 2008 with indie publishing and social media, we decided that agents really needed to change too, or we'd get squeezed out of the value equation between authors and publishers. So we are looking at every facet of being a literary agent and changing that on a whim, I guess. What I'm going to do is, this is changes in book publishing. And what I'm going to do is introduce the person who I'm going to ask the question to. My panel rebelled on me. We had a revolution out in the hallway, and they decided they didn't want to each talk for 10 minutes on their question. So the person I asked the question to is going to start, and then they're going to have a little discussion. But don't worry, we won't go over an hour, and there'll be plenty of time for you guys to ask your own personal questions here too. So let's begin. This is an insider look at an industry in transition as technology redefines the relationship among authors, publishers, and readers. What new opportunities does this present? How do writers and editors make their mark? We are going to have award-winning authors, noted publishers, and editors, moderated by me. The first person to talk will be Wall Street Journal and Amazon Kindle best-selling author Carrie Lonsdale. She's an author of women's fiction. Her two best-selling novels are Everything We Keep and All the Breaking Waves. She's a founder of the Women's Fiction Writers Association, an online community of over 800 women's fiction writers. So if you write women's fiction, you might want to think about joining that online. Carrie also told me earlier today that they're having an actual conference in Redwood City in May. So you might want to look at, well, I'm sure Carrie will tell you more about it. Her forthcoming novel is, I forgot. What is it? You'll have to say.
Everything We Left Behind.
Everything We Left Behind. So she's really writing it. Okay, so let me get to Carrie's question here. There would be no question that Amazon is a game changer for book publishing. Some would argue that Amazon is the spark that ignited the revolution in the first place, with the Kindle, KDP, indie publishing, becoming a mega distributor, and their numbers-based algorithmic marketing approach. From self-publishing to Amazon imprints to Amazon Studios and streaming video, Amazon is the huge gorilla in the room. Carrie and others too who have worked with Amazon, how has Amazon helped your career, and how can all types of authors use its power for their own gain? So get right up on that microphone.
Get right up on the mic. We got a two-part question here. Just hello, everyone. I am with Lake Union Publishing, which is an imprint of Amazon Publishing, and that's the traditional publishing arm of Amazon services. So for the first part of the question, as to how it's benefited me, I think Amazon Publishing's marketing efforts, at least what they have done for me, which has included their Kindle First program, Prime Reading, ongoing and frequent emails to their members, and they have a lot of members. They've done banner ads on the websites, and they have book recommendations based off of what reader browsing and book purchasing habits, as well as their strategic pricing. I think Amazon's marketing efforts have put probably more books into the hands of readers than I, as an author, could have done with my own marketing efforts, or I do personally believe with another traditional publisher because of all the specialized programs that they have. Granted, my books, since I am with an Amazon publishing, they are not readily available in bookstores as they are with other traditional publishers, but they are available where an increasing population is buying, and that is online. So I can continue to talk, or we could throw it over to someone else.
Anybody want to talk about their relationship with Amazon and how it's helped you or hindered you?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll go after you.
So my book of short stories came out last fall, and something I had heard and put into practice was the importance of Amazon reviews. So I got a group, I had an electronic galley, and 3 months before, I sort of sent a note out to all my besties and to writers I know, and if you are you're writing for long enough, you get to know a lot of people. So I did the initial ask 2 or 3 months before, then I did a follow-up a month before, then a day before, and it really helped. I'm told that it helps raise your ranking. kind of comes up as recommendations. So it's all to the good. I mean, because I read somewhere that Amazon perhaps sells more than 60% of books in the country, so it is an important channel. At the same time, I think we can't underestimate the importance of independent bookstores. They may be a smaller sales channel, yet they're very influential, and so it's important. I tell people, buy my book at an independent bookstore, but then review it on Amazon. So. And I mean, I have an author newsletter, so I've offered, hey, here's a short story that didn't appear in the collection. I'll send it to you for free if you write a review. And I mean, and I tell people, like, just a sentence, and 5 stars. But I think part of the whole process of getting your work out there, that's a way of honoring your work. No matter how icky or strange it feels suddenly, doing all the publicity for it. But whatever you can do to get your work out there, this is what you have to do these days, with or without Amazon. So
I've actually had some of my clients say, in lieu of birthday presents or in lieu of wedding presents, please review my book on Amazon.
Yeah.
The rumor is that if you can get 50 reviews posted on Amazon, they haven't admitted to this, that's what kicks in the emails that go out to their members for the book recommendations and suggestions. And that's why a lot of authors are very aggressive in saying, please, please review.
Right. I'll say, I'm the publisher of She Writes Press, and I have such a love-hate relationship with Amazon, and I actually truly love and truly hate them. It's one of the things I'll say to the group here is that categories matter so much, and one of the reasons that I have a hate relationship with them is, as a publisher, it's actually very difficult to get our categories changed or even to influence our categories because we don't have a direct relationship with Amazon. Our relationship is through Ingram to Amazon, and so if anyone has a traditional publishing deal, you are suffering a lot more than if you are a self-published author or if you publish with Amazon, in which case Amazon can do whatever Amazon wants to do. So it's one of these, I'm going to be talking a little bit in my part about hybrid publishing and alternative publishing, and there's so much different stuff, so many changes in publishing right now, but I would say Amazon is using its muscle to influence the market in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that they're doing is really wanting to have a direct relationship with authors and, where they can, with publishers. And so for traditional publishers, it creates a lot of friction because we're unable to, I guess, take advantage of some of the things that Amazon offers their self-published authors. So it's just, depending on where you sit, kind of understanding what Amazon does and where it's helpful and where it hinders, I think is really important. And then also certainly to take advantage of them where you can. And then I super support Vanessa to say, really send people to indie bookstores, because if you don't, we're going to be without them, probably within our lifetimes.
Having said that, though, Amazon sells 70% of the ebooks and more than half of the print books in the United States. So people are voting with their dollars, and I'm sure we're all guilty. I try and buy some at every part of the ecosystem. I'll buy indie, I'll buy Barnes & Nobles, I'll buy direct from the author, and I'll buy at Amazon. So, I can't say to people, please don't buy at Amazon, but maybe spread the love around a little bit. In fact, we're having a book signing out there after this session is over, and if you like what some particular author or publisher or editor had to say, perhaps you'll support them out there. How about that for a nice shill? You can tell I'm the agent of the crowd here. Okay, anybody have anything else to say about Amazon? Other than, Carrie, they made you a bestseller, so they can't be all bad, right?
I know.
Okay, next up is Vanessa Hua, a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and author of Deceit and Other Possibilities, winner of the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature. She has received awards from the Rona Jaffe Writers Foundation, Society of Professional Journalists, and Asian American Journalists Association. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and elsewhere.
So I've been writing my whole life. I remember in the second grade, we had to write short stories in class, and then the class voted with a show of hands which story was the best, and mine won. But then I heard my classmate immediately lean over and say, I only voted for it because it was the longest. So it was both my first publishing success and my first snarky review. So, and like many of you here, probably I was a big reader as well. I'm the American-born daughter of Chinese immigrants, and so I think I found in books answers that I didn't find at home. And you know, the world at home is very different from the world outside, and so I found characters I could relate to, even if we didn't share the same face or background or era. In college, I started getting interested in journalism. I think just in both my journalism and my fiction, I've always been driven to shine a light onto untold stories and to tell stories that no one else can. And so whether that draws upon my cultural or language abilities or you know, just telling stories, I don't want to go chasing after the same story that everyone else is telling. I want to tell the story that only I can tell. So I focused on journalism for a few years after graduating, and then in 2004, I thought, oh, I was reading some stories from college. I'm like, these are pretty good, but I don't know if I remember how to do this. And so I started taking community writing workshops, going to writing conferences like SQUA and Napa Valley, and really starting to take part in literary community, which is very rich and supportive in the Bay Area. I then ended up going to grad school where I wanted to work on my novel, to have time, space, and resources to work on it. I also continued to freelance and continued working on my short stories. And for me, I feel like my journalism training has been really helpful because I have, you know, the discipline of writing daily. I don't, you know, I'm open to being edited. Nothing is too precious that can't be changed, except for the things that really can't be changed. And just, you know, gave me the freedom, the license to go out in the world and ask why, or to, you know, the honor and privilege to be able to meet people and have them tell me their stories. So my fiction, all that has contributed to my fiction, that same curiosity, and I think for me, a lot of the short stories in my book, whether it's about a Stanford imposter or about a Korean missionary who is keeping a secret from his church, they all stemmed from stories I read or conversations I had. So again, I was driven to tell this untold stories about characters caught up in their secrets and lies. So how fiction has helped my journalism is it's taught me to more deeply consider aspects of setting and character. You know, it's more than just, I remember looking at my first newspaper stories and it was like I was taking dictation. You know, oh, did I get the quote right? But there's so much more to writing a story, like the narrative movement and the development of character that I think my fiction has now brought to my journalism. Although at some events, some readers in the audience have asked, like, what's the difference between nonfiction and fiction? I'm like, well, you get to make things up in fiction. And someone even asked, do you ever get confused and start to write fiction? No. The answer is no. But that said, I think the mix of deadlines has been really good for me because a novel is a years-long marathon with no guarantees, whereas I get the quicker satisfaction of a weekly column. And have you guys heard of Country Joe McDonald? He's written me a couple fan notes, so he's alive and well. So I was very excited, and it kind of blew my mind that like I knew people I didn't know were reading about my kids, but then somehow it made it like even more bizarre that this icon from the Summer of Love knew all about them. So some thoughts on how journalism can help your author platform. That is how you can sell your books. This is important both when you're searching for an agent and when it comes time after a book is published. So being in journalism helps editors get to know you and your work. So I remember a book editor said you should write book reviews, even long before you might have a book, because it just introduces you to that staff member. And it's another way of taking part in literary community, doing a Q&A for a new author and putting it on something like the Rumpus or the LA Review of Books. That's all a way of taking part in community. And so I've been filling out the author questionnaire for my novel, which is, as I mentioned, coming out next year. And it's really interesting because it's this very, very extensive sheet. And one of they want to know basically, who do you know in the media? And who, so it's important if you are doing journalistic work that, you have those connections. And they also ask if you're willing to write essays. And again, if you have experience writing nonfiction, then it can help, help with the success and building your platform. And I have other things to say, but I'll continue, I'll chime in after. But
I just jump in and echo everything you've said as someone who writes fiction, but before my novel came out, wrote for a lot of different outlets, more social commentary than journalism per se. But the other thing that was really, really helpful for me in doing that is it taught me how to pitch. So it taught me how to just pitch the story. It taught me how to actually create an email pitch, but also how to deal with sort of the emotional roller coaster of I really, waiting to hear back, feeling nervous, and just putting myself out there. And I noticed as a debut author, I was on the debutante ball with several other authors, so we were really going through the same thing, and I noticed that all the work that I had done in journalism around pitching helped me so much when it was time to ask for people to review and blurb my book, and when it was time to ask people to ask folks to pitch stories that I would write that had tie-ins to the book, that learning how to pitch is just an incredible skill. And that was where I really learned.
Yeah, and becoming good at pitching means you become good at also dealing with rejection. And that's just a part of a writer's life. So.
Anybody else want to say anything about their journey towards publishing, fiction or nonfiction? All right, we'll move on. See, we're not going to waste your time. Okay, Aya de Leon teaches creative writing at UC Berkeley, and she's also a poet and a novelist. Kensington Books publishes her feminist heist trilogy, Uptown Thief, which is out now, The Boss, which comes out when?
May 30th.
May 30th, coming up, and The Accidental Mistress, which comes out next year. Her work has appeared in Ebony, Guernica, Writer's Digest, Bitch Magazine, and Huffington Post, and she recently completed a Black Spy Girl YA novel. Now, my question to you, Aya, is about social media. Social media has been a huge part of the revolution going on in book publishing. Authors can talk directly to their fan base without the need for an annual book tour. Readers can find each other and share books they love. Authors don't have to spend thousands of dollars to launch their books via costly advertising, book tours, and drive-time radio interviews. Can you offer some pragmatic tips for social media platforms that resonate with specific genres of books and how social media empowers authors to take control of their messages and interactions? And everyone else can chime in on that too.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing that I need to say is I was very much late to the social media revolution. In 2000, my career took off in spoken word, so I was doing a lot of performing. And so social media, where you have an online audience, didn't seem relevant to me at the time because I had an actual audience that I was interacting with on a weekly basis in the Bay Area, and then I got a booking agent who would book me touring throughout the country doing spoken word and hip hop theater. And I made my living as a writer-performer. And I was on the hustle. So at that time, social media, seemed like something I didn't need, but as blogging was coming up, it felt like, wow, a whole lot more writing that I would, do for no money, right? So it didn't make sense to me at the time. Then in 2006, I started teaching here at UC Berkeley. And then the next thing that happened was I was perceived as a gatekeeper. So I would get lots of people sending me their books and asking me like, oh, can you book me in your class? Like so-and-so is a speaker. And the degree to which I was perceived as a gatekeeper made things like Facebook look horrifying to me, because it was an opportunity for more people to have access to pitch me with things that so people, there was a perception that like I could really get people hooked up, and people were, oh, are there jobs at Berkeley? So all social media just looked like a time-sucking pit that meant my novel would never get finished. And, people have different opinions about whether or not it is. But what that meant for me was that I just really avoided Facebook, because I didn't want more friends, and I didn't want people to think that they were my friend so that they could be friendly with me because there was something that they wanted, right? And to this day, I'm not on Facebook as someone who can be friended. I do have an author page, however. But then in 2009, everything changed because I had a kid, and suddenly I was not in nightclubs sharing my work with my community. I was at home desperate for community, and suddenly having a life online looked very appealing. And that was when I got my Facebook author page. That was when I did develop a WordPress blog. And I, for me, the social media platform that really speaks to me is Twitter. More on that in a minute, but I think it's important to think about social media because people will say, oh, you should get on this, or oh, you should get on that, but it really has to be the right fit. So Instagram and Pinterest, there has to be something visual. Like people have said to authors, oh, you should get on Pinterest. Well, if you're not generating anything visual, you probably shouldn't. And just thinking about what is the content. Twitter, you have to be brief and concise, but have something to say. Like I see people with these tweets like 1 of 15, and it's like, or people who go on Twitter rants, it's like, you need a blog. But what I will say about Twitter, I am someone who, my spoken word was very much social commentary, and when I was writing for outlets, a lot of social commentary. So Twitter is a wonderful outlet for writers, and particularly for social commentary. The fiction I write is feminist heist novels. And so feminist Twitter is a place that I love. The kind of the politics of Twitter and having curated being able to see what other people are reading and sharing in a curated way, but that's quick, has been great for me because Twitter is so brief and compact. The other thing, my characters are in a community of sex workers. So Twitter was a really effective way to get into contact with folks in sex worker communities internationally. And Twitter, because it's very anonymous and because sex workers are stigmatized and often criminalized, was a place where people were speaking really candidly. And it was a great place for me to network and get information, consultants for the work that I was doing. And just political content. There's a lot of really great political content on Twitter. There are also problems, particularly in terms of trolling, and that's real, and I get trolled regularly. But still, there's a vibrantness to that community that has meant a lot to me. And the other thing that I will say that's been great about blogging, connected to the time when I was doing more quasi-journalistic stuff and pitching a lot of stories to different outlets. What was great about pitching and having a blog is that, there'd be a story that I'd be fascinated with, I'd be developing the story, I'd pitch it to various outlets, and if nobody took it, I could always post it on my blog while it was still newsworthy and sort of in the news cycle. So for me, that's been my journey in terms of social media, and I think the critical thing that's been great for me as a writer, as I mentioned before, I came to fiction writing having had a career as a writer that I was 15 years in, and I know myself and I know the kind of thing I have to say and am able to have a strong perspective and opinion, and that's definitely helped me build my platform. And I encourage writers who are still finding their voice, etc., definitely to find the social media that's fun and engaging for them, as opposed to like, I'm doing this because I must and it's drudgery. So I'll stop there.
Hey, Naheed, you haven't said too much down there, but you are a children's book author, and I'm just wondering if you could say a couple things about how that's a bit of a different audience to reach on social media because you have to go through the gatekeepers of parents and teachers and librarians, and that definitely adds a level of complexity towards, getting your brand out there because you can't reach out to the kids directly a lot.
Right. Well, there's a difference definitely between picture books, right, for much younger kids, and middle grade versus YA. YA is a bit different. Young adult literature geared, towards 13 and above. A lot of these kids are on social media. So a lot of, there's a lot of young adult bloggers who, can be very influential for YA authors. So for myself, since I gear more towards middle grade and picture books, for me, social media is more aimed towards, librarians, and also influencers, reviewers, and Twitter as well. So it's used in a very, very different way. And same thing with disposable income as well. I mean, teens are more likely to go out and, buy ebooks or buy the books versus for the younger kids.
Okay. And then Lisa, I thought maybe you could mention, since you've got so many budding authors out here, what can an author do to get your attention on social media, or is that it just so loud and noisy and, convoluted right now that pretty much they can't?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, so I'm an editor in nonfiction books, and in the nonfiction world, I think social media is even more important than in fiction in terms of author platform and whether I'm going to consider that their project. And I had lunch in real life with my friends, and they were like, "Oh, do you know how I posted this and that the other day?" I was like, "Nope." So I guess all my friends are off doing something on Facebook that I am not a part of anymore, but that's okay because I have my sanity. And so, yeah, I would say reaching out to at least a nonfiction editor, your platform is very important, how many followers you have on these things, but not reaching out via social media. I would say we don't have a slush pile anymore, per se. A slush pile is where unagented projects come in and are reviewed by like an editorial assistant. But, I'm an executive editor, and if an author emails me directly, I will look at their project. Of course, if an agent emails me, I'll look at it quicker. So.
Yay, I like that answer. Brooke, do you want to add anything into this about what an author's social media presence maybe means for their platform? Or
Right. I coach writers too on platform, and so it's a topic that I think a lot about and I write a lot about. And I used to be an executive editor like Lisa for Seal Press, which is a women's press here in Berkeley. And one thing I just want to drive home, even though we're talking about social media, is that your platform is actually so much bigger than just social media. And so social media is really important, but it's less important than your newsletter database and how many people you can respond to. And editors are getting more and more savvy about people with tons of followers but no interaction. And so editors more and more are going onto Facebook and Twitter, and they're looking at how many likes you have and how many comments you have. And so I just want to drive home the value of real community and real interactions, and not just being on there just because you think you're supposed to be, and doing the things that are to support your platform that are meaningful to you, because those are the places where you're going to have passion and where you're going to have drive. And so Nancy, who had to leave, was just telling me she's starting a podcast, and I was like, that's perfect, because it really suits her. And podcasts and teaching online and a million other ways to reach your potential fan base beyond social media. And I think it doesn't mean abandon social media, but I just want to make it clear that as editors, and this continues to be the case for me as a publisher, I'm looking at a way bigger pie when it comes to author platform than just social media.
good point. And we could talk about social media for the whole rest of this hour, but when you go to the book signing, ask them questions. Ask them for their number one tip on what social media things have worked for them or what they like to see. Moving along. Now we're going to talk to Nahid Sensei, who writes as N.H. Sensei. She's the author of Shooting Kabul, chosen by the Asian Pacific Librarians Association as their young adult literature winner and an NPR's Backseat Book Club pick, along with an Edgar Award nominee, Saving Kabul Corner, and Ticket to India. She spent her childhood in San Francisco and Jubail, Saudi Arabia, high school in London, where she was voted most likely to lead a literary revolution. Oh, I guess there's a story behind that. Her upcoming novel is Escape from Aleppo, about a girl fleeing Syria at the advent of the Arab Spring. Nahid, your question. We've been talking a lot about diversity today, gender imbalance, racial and ethnic insensitivity, LGBTQ discrimination. Having women as decision makers in publishing doesn't seem to have swayed racial figures, and we've seen similar tensions even within such watershed events as the recent Women's March in Washington, which is where you're going. Not to the Women's March, but you're going to Washington tomorrow. Just because you are a woman doesn't mean you own tolerance. Since books are such a powerful vehicle for changing opinions, what's the future of diversity in the book publishing industry, and not only for diverse voices? I know that that's a horrible question to ask you to get out your crystal ball and say what's going to happen, but just share your thoughts, please.
Sure, absolutely. So I love the comment about, women, being powerful in publishing, and it's true. I'll share some statistics about that. I'm an accountant by trade, so I always say to kids when I do school visits is, if usually I have them guess what my major was in college, and they say English or writing, but it's accounting and finance. And I say, if you can be anything and be a writer too, and they get a kick out of that. So my publisher is Simon & Schuster, and Simon & Schuster recently made an offer to Milo Yiannopoulos. And the imprint that gave that offer was Threshold, which is run by a woman. And Simon & Schuster's CEO is also a woman. Now, it's interesting for me because as a children's authors in Simon & Schuster, a whole slew of us wrote them a letter stating that our goal as children's writers is to promote diversity, understanding, yada, yada, yada. So that point is very well taken. At the end of the day, money matters, and a lot of decisions that are made are financially driven, whether you are a woman or a man. So coming back to kind of the state of publishing today, I think our keynote for lunch, our award-winning Janice Min stated it well. People tend to hire who they know and what they know, and that's very true in publishing. And also, people tend to review who they know and what they know, and they tend to give awards to people who they know and what they know. So back in 1965, there was an article published about the all-white children's publishing world. And it revealed that out of the 5,206 children's trade books published over the 3 years, 63 publishers, only 349, which is about 6.7%, had one or more African-American characters. And at that time, 8 publishers had no diverse characters at all. So fast forward to 1994. And sadly, the publishing industry remained older, wider, and richer. And flash forward again 20 years, and the business has changed, and I'll talk a little bit about how there's more of a pull that people are actually demanding more diversity in writing, in publishing, but it's been a very, very gradual process. So Lee & Low Publishers, which is a really amazing publishing house that promotes a lot of diverse literature, they actually did a study on the publishing industry, and what they found was that 79% of the executives and the editorial staff, 79% were white Caucasian, and 78% were women. So this is actually an industry dominated by women. So that's an interesting takeaway. 88% were straight and heterosexual, and 82% were not differently abled. So it's a very homogenous, pull. I mean, these are the folks making the decisions on what they're acquiring. And it's important to note that, it's at that time, out of that number, African Americans only represent about 2% of executives and editors. So there is a push. A lot of these publishing houses are having conversations. They're having campaigns to build at the bottom level to bring in people as editorial assistants and going out to universities and trying to change that, which has been great. Now, since I focus more on the children's side, out of the 3,400 books that were published in 2016, there is still, once again, very little representation from diverse authors. And a challenge there also is when there is diversity in books, it's not always written in own voice. So there's been a big challenge about, who is writing, who are the people writing these stories. So then it leads down into reviewers. There's a big challenge of who's reviewing these books and what are their inputs and what is their analysis. There is a recent book that was slated to come out. It was called When We Was Fierce. It's about African American gang members, and it's written by a very honorable author who's a Latina. And when that book had its initial reviews, it got starred reviews. But when two African American librarians reviewed the book, they realized there were serious issues on the portrayals of the characters and the language being used. So it took two insiders to know what is going on. So, those are all the negative sides, but especially in the last 2 years, there's been a movement with We Need Diverse Books, which started out actually as hashtags on Twitter, in reaction to the fact that there is more diversity that is needed. And also coming back to my publishing house, Simon & Schuster, they recently launched an imprint called Salam Reads, which is focused on Muslim children. So the nice thing is that, there is change coming, but, there's a lot of work to be done.
I will say one thing that I think is funny is I was just watching the previous panel. There was a lot of talk about, editors and women trying to, communicate effectively with product people and engineers who might be primarily male. And in publishing, it's kind of the opposite. In a lot of our meetings, we're a bunch of women, and then we'll say something that makes the one man in the room feel awkward. So I just thought that was a kind of a funny reversal. Sometimes I feel bad for the one guy in publishing. But yeah, the other thing I will say about diversity in books is that sometimes it makes it a lot more interesting to read something from a diverse voice, and that can actually be helpful and welcomed by people more and more. I acquired a book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, which is by a Japanese author, Marie Kondo, and I think that prior to this, there hadn't really been a Japanese import book that had really succeeded in the American market. And part of what really interested me when I was first reading the proposal was just the fact that it was kind of an interesting window into the daily life of people in Japan, and kind of the similarities and differences. And there was kind of an armchair travel aspect to that. And of course, you have to avoid the fetishization, say that 3 times, of other cultures. But at the same time, I think people want to read about other cultures. So I think there's a positive, and there's something that people are actually looking for more and more.
One thing that I would add is when it comes to issues of diversity in publishing, particularly with regard to racial diversity, I think I see the publishing industry kind of struggling to figure it out and to make changes. And I just think it's important to ground those problems as not originating inside of the publishing industry. This is about how does the industry deal with the reality of racism in the US, right? And so part of the reality of racism has to do with the devaluing of people of color, and we see with the Black Lives Matter movement, this whole question of do Black Lives Matter in the area of police violence? And I think within publishing, what we see is do the stories of people of color matter, and do they matter enough that that the industry will actually back those stories, particularly not just stories that have like the one brown kid or the quirky Latina best friend, or and particularly stories that are written by white people about people of color, but actually support the more complex and unexpected visions coming from communities of color. And the challenge there is that not only is there the history of racism that has affected the publishing industry, but it's also affected the reading audiences. So when you have a profit-driven industry, that the bottom line is we want to have books that appeal to as many people as possible. What we know in a society that is white dominated and majority white is that the understanding, the cultural understanding of racism is that white is supposedly universal, and that white people will buy books about white people, and that people of color often will too. But it's not always true in reverse, right? It's not always true that we can expect the masses of white audiences to buy stories by and about people of color. And that is really the thing that needs to change. That is the racism in the society. And so I think it's important not to act like racism was the publishing industry's bright idea, and that it's an inherited problem, but also to really think about how to change that and how the publishing industry really can play a huge role in affecting racism when people do have windows into each other's lives and not stereotype. The other thing that I'll say that is really classic in the industry when writers of color, particularly Black and Latino writers, have their books coming out of big 5 publishers, a lot of times those publishers really don't know how to market to their communities. That those publishers often, unless it's a particular imprint that targets that community, they really may not know how to market to their community. I'm really fortunate because within Kensington, my imprint primarily markets to young women of color. And for me, actually, the challenge is how do I market more broadly? But in a lot of ways, as a Black writer and, well, a Black Latina writer, that's a great problem for me to have. So I just think that it's always important to talk about diversity really clearly. It's about the inequality and isms that are happening in the society that then get reflected in the industry.
Those are really good points, everyone. Okay, moving on. Lisa Westmoreland is the executive editor at 10 Speed Press, which is an imprint of Crown Books, which is part of Penguin Random House. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in English literature from Stanford and lives right here in the Bay Area. Lisa, 10 Speed Press is an imprint, as I said, of Penguin Random House, which is the largest book publisher on the planet. In fact, Penguin Random House is larger than the remaining 4 of the big 5 publishers put together. I thought Lisa might be able to give us a good perspective on publishing in Manhattan, which is really the core of where book publishing is right now, but 10 Speed Press is located in Berkeley. So East Coast bias is not unique to traditional book publishing, but it does seem especially prominent there. While small niche publishing is an effective antidote to New York centrism, which Brooke will talk about in more detail next, how can authors who are not located in Manhattan break into the New York City mindset? And will big 5 publishers ever locate elsewhere, let their editors work remotely from less costly cities? And if New York will always be publishing's hub for books, how can non-New Yorkers make it work for them?
Yeah, so
Yeah, that's a big question,
absolutely. Well, 10 Speed used to be an indie publishing house, and then the owner was dying, and he sold the company to Random House, I think in 2009, so about 8 years ago. And the first time I went to Random House, New York, I did feel like the culture was a bit different, and they kind of saw me as a hippie. They were like, "Oh, you hippie, you're from the Bay Area." I don't know why they sounded like that. That was a weird voice. And little did they know I'm actually from Philadelphia. So, but I kept that to myself because I actually do believe that people from across the whole country can use wherever they're from to their own advantage. So we've actually used the fact that we're located in the Bay Area to really stand out within the Penguin Random House sphere. Like, oh, we're the really forward-thinking imprint. We're getting the trends earlier. We're learning about really new radical health trends, or like spirituality trends, or like more liberal trends, kind of maybe a little bit before New York. And so for authors, you can really use wherever you're from to convince a publisher potentially in New York that you are a great conduit to your market wherever you are. What I will say is, if you're an author, one thing that you could do is get an agent who has close relationships with editors in New York, or with, in a larger city, like an agent who's in New York or an agent who's in the Bay Area. Sometimes there is a little bit of snobbery in terms of seeing where an agent is located, in terms of how much authority maybe an editor will think that they have in the publishing world, or what kind of clients they might have. But yeah, so you could always get an agent to kind of cover a different location for you. The thing I will say about working remotely, or just being wherever you are, is it's becoming so much more and more common. I don't think people bat an eye wherever you're from, because, technology is really helping with that. The first time I had to join a meeting that was taking place primarily in New York, I had to call in at 6:30 a.m. So I actually did that meeting from my bed. And that was awkward. And I was presenting like a project that I wanted to acquire. I'm like lying in bed. I think that as relationships build and as more and more people work remotely, people are becoming more aware of, the New Yorkers are going to schedule a meeting with us at a time that works for us, and we're going to kind of vice versa. There are more and more people working remotely from all over the country. I was looking at articles about this, and like 3 years ago, there was an article like, a quarter of people have worked remotely once. And then it was like a year later, it was like a third of people work remotely sometimes. And now it's like almost half of people work remotely sometimes. And so it's becoming more and more common to do that. And I actually work remotely 1 day a week because I live in Gasp, San Mateo. So, just with traffic, sometimes people want to work remotely. So, I think it's becoming much more normalized. If you're an author, sometimes you will get asked to go to New York to do a proposal pitch meetings with editors. So sometimes physical presence still helps. If you're shopping around a proposal, your agent might fly you to New York to take some meetings. And actually, a lot of the most successful people who work remotely at our publishing company used to work in the office. So sometimes, building that personal relationship or having a face-to-face moment at the start can then open you up to be anywhere for the whole rest of the time. Does that answer all those multi-layers?
Cool. Anybody else want to say anything about working remotely? Because I would think that you have to talk to your editor who's back in New York.
My editor was in New York. She's in Colorado now. And actually, Salam Reed's, the editor, is based out of LA. But they began in the New York office.
Yeah, I think I so agree. I mean, the trend, obviously, is that people are working more and more remotely. Our whole office practically is remote. But I did want to just piggyback on something Lisa said, which I think is really important about the sensibilities of different presses. Because when I was at Seal, and I've always worked in Bay Area publishing, it's really actually an asset if you're a West Coast author, or if you have a certain kind of book that has a West Coast flavor, to find an agent or editors in West Coast locations, because to the point of, you acquire what you know, that is also regional. And so some people just have this dream of New York publishing, that it somehow is better for all kinds of reasons, but it's so much about fit. I think that people understand that, of course, but it just, I found, when I was at Seal in particular, we had a lot of West Coast pride. And we would therefore, the majority of our authors, just sort of because we were such a West Coast office, were West Coast authors. And of course, we had authors from all around the country and all over the world, but the majority were LA, Bay Area, Seattle, Portland writers.
Brooke is the former executive editor of Seal Press, and she writes a monthly column for Publishers Weekly and blogs actively on Huffington Post books and shewrites.com. So Brooke, we're going to talk about the democratization of book publishing with a small d. She Writes would not have been possible without a democratization in book publishing. From the tech tools you need to be a publisher, to self-publishing and hybrid publishing, to new distribution channels and marketing, and new revenue-sharing models. Your publishing model has emerged as an alternative to the Big Five blockbuster approach. The book publishing model has resisted platform rivalry better than most other segments of the industry, but this has mainly been because of consolidation. What are the evolving obstacles to success for a small, regional, niche, or hybrid publisher, and what will the inevitable convergence be due to this democratization? Boy, I am asking all you guys really tough questions here. They didn't seem tough when I was creating them, but now that I'm reading them, I'm like, how do you answer this?
They're panel descriptions. So I will start by giving a little bit of my story. As I said, I was at Seal Press, and I was there for 8 years, and I left as an executive editor. And my story of why I left is in the introduction of my book, Greenlight Your Book, so I won't tell you the whole story, but it really stemmed from a disillusion with the traditional industry and my own frustration because Seal was a true independent darling. I mean, much like 10-Speed before Phil died. And there's a lot of Bay Area publishers that, were steeped in kind of a 1970s worldview, and Seal was one of those feminist presses, a darling. And so when I started working there, it was very mission-driven, and I fell in love with that about it. And I got to acquire books that I thought really mattered and that were important and that fit my values. So when we got acquired by Perseus, and just recently Seal got acquired by Hachette. So what Laurie is talking about with the consolidation of book publishing is really sometimes, not always, I think 10-Speed has done a great job actually, but sometimes what results is a loss of personality. This sort of subsuming that happens means that, there's already is sort of a myopic vision, and I think that's what we've been talking about here. The publishing's inability to take risks there's many reasons why that's happening, and to Aya's point, I think publishing is mirroring the larger culture, and it's why there's not enough diverse books. But the consolidation is another huge problem because what it means is that they're really looking for blockbusters. And when I was my last years at Seal, there was always this rallying cry at editorial meetings like, "Go get big books." And that drove me crazy. I'm like, what is a big book, and what are we even talking about? So I started really falling out of love with traditional publishing, and so I started a non-traditional press, and that's what She Writes Press is. And it really just to go back to my values, because what we do is we publish the content that we want to publish. It is solely content driven. The author does not actually need to have a platform. I'm a big fan of using a book to build a platform, and I think in today's day and age, it's just incredibly difficult. The barriers to entry in traditional publishing are so high, and authors are getting frustrated all over the place. And so with the democratization of publishing, in my opinion, is people like me who are getting disillusioned with the traditional space and are increasingly open to trying different ways of publishing. And so as this has happened, because those barriers to entry are really high and they are somewhat arbitrary. The reasons why people aren't getting published today, in my opinion, have nothing to do with how good their work is, but instead have to do with them not having a big enough author platform, not being mediagenic enough, not having enough followers. There's many, many reasons. Other reasons for rejection might include, we just published a book that's kind of like yours, like remotely similar to your book. We already have a Black author on our list this season. Whatever these things are, and it's very sort of tokenism in that sense. So what I, of course, like about the democratization of publishing is that we, as She Writes Press, are not bound by all of those problematic rules. Now, it's a author-invested publishing platform, so there are money problems, and that's a separate conversation. I mean, in the sense that when you choose to publish, or as I say, greenlight yourself, you have to put your money where your mouth is, and that brings up other problems of who can afford to publish. So this is by no means a flawless situation that I find myself in, but I do love the fact that authors are greenlighting themselves more, both in the self-publishing capacity, and we call ourselves a hybrid press. And in the years that I've been doing this, which is 5 years now, there's been a huge sea change just in the terms of how respected it is to publish alternatively. And that has been a huge boon for me personally, and I think for authors and people who are choosing to independently publish, because the industry is sort of having to realize that a lot of those books actually are competing with their traditional counterparts. And even though there is so much resistance in the publishing world, and even though the word disruption is well overused, this is a hugely disruptive time in publishing. So I hope that we'll continue, we will continue to see the democratization of publishing, and I think the new challenge, that edge is gonna be, because more and more people are greenlighting themselves, and because it takes money to do that, how will we continue to publish diverse voices? She Writes Press is having a contest, it's a scholarship program for women of color writers, which is just one super small step. But I think that, I'm interested in these kinds of conversations, because I realize that, where we have been able to open a door, it's not a door that's open to everyone. So I think that concludes it.
I do think things like print on demand have really helped the rise of small presses that have gone on to produce award-winning books, because they no longer have to have a warehouse full of books that they hope might sell. And so that's why we've seen, I was talking to a publisher out of Brooklyn, and she said the only thing that really stops you from having a press is saying, I'm going to have a press, because, you can, I know someone who just started a press. He doesn't offer advances, but your book is out in the world. And so there's just these thoughts about, it's just interesting what technology is doing, because in some ways I think there are more paths than there ever were before to getting published. But it's that question of, what are the advantages or disadvantages of both, or what, can a book that's published non-traditionally still reach, the reviewers or the audience through your own hustle? So, yeah.
Yeah, just as there used to be a lot of stigma with online dating way back when, and now there isn't at all. It's the same thing with self-publishing. There's not that stigma about self-publishing anymore. And I've definitely had instances where a self-published book has sold so many copies and jumped over one of the books that I acquired in a space where I try to acquire that book, and try to bring it into the big publishing fold. And sometimes that works. Sometimes they really like the idea, or sometimes with 50 Shades of Grey, I'm sure they gave her a huge advance, and she was already raking in the dough before that. I had nothing to do with that book. But I've also had instances where the self-published author cannot be convinced to come with me. You know what I mean? They're making so much money on their own. They're like, sorry, I'm like fulfilling my dream and moving to Portugal. I'm not going to deal with you. I can now fund my dreams. And so, there's a lot of variety now in the ways that people are able to publish, reach people, and make money.
Now, who has a question? Here's one.
I have a question for Carrie. So when you finish your first manuscript, why did you decide to go with Amazon Publishing versus one of the big fives in New York? And what's your experience like working with Amazon, in terms of editorial and the whole process of publishing?
The second manuscript is the one that published last July, and like every other writer out there, I hit the query trenches. It was probably queried about 160 times through several revisions or whatnot, because you start listening to the feedback and you know what resonates with you. When got an agent, went out on submission, and went to auction, and we went with Amazon, and my personal experience with Amazon Publishing has been fantastic, especially from an editorial standpoint. They run it through a developmental editing phase, which is about 4 to 6 weeks. Then we have a copy editor that works on it. Then we have proof edits, and then we have a couple cold readers put on it. And their production tail is a little bit quicker than other traditional publishers, where your book can be acquired and it can take about another 12 to 18 months before it's actually out there on the shelves. Mine was, I think, 12 months, actually less than 12 months. And I've actually had 3 books that are publishing here in less than a year. So it's been pretty crazy. Yes.
Next question.
So one of the drawbacks of self-publishing not that long ago was the distribution strategy, and now that has changed. So can someone talk to why, how, what's coming up?
When I left Seal, we were obviously a traditional publisher, and that was what I knew. I understood distribution and how it worked. And so when I started She Writes Press, we did not have distribution. We were just using Lightning Source, which is a division of Ingram that allows for your books to get out into the marketplace. But essentially what it is fulfillment. It's not actually distribution. And distribution, from my understanding of what it was and is that you have a sales force that pre-sells your book into the marketplace. And so at 1 year into my time at She Writes Press, I was hitting my head against the wall with all the frustrations of what we did not have access to. And so I actually did go out and solicit traditional distribution. I think part of the reason I was able to do that was because of my long time in the industry, and so we now have traditional distribution through Ingram. I would say there are actually serious pros and cons to distribution. And the deal is, for a lot of authors, because we do so much fiction and memoir, what traditional distribution has allowed for us is more traditional reviews, more availability in the marketplace, certainly better access into libraries. And so I would say that the stigma about self-publishing has reduced greatly, but within the industry, it's alive and well. And it's about access and availability and qualifying for reviews and contests and associations. There's a lot of real resistance to self-published authors having access to things that traditional authors have access to. And I think in these 5 years that I've been doing this non-traditionally, that it's all about distribution. Bottom line, I wrote a post that said about the new gatekeepers are distributors, because it's the distributors that are giving you access to these traditional channels. So it's still a problem. It's still definitely a problem for self-published authors that I would love to see solved, because I actually really believe in the democratization. I think that if we could solve the distribution problem that exists and that self-published authors had equal access, then we would truly see a level playing field.
I would add, when I was querying my agents with my novel and just feeling incredibly frustrated. I had this idea for a children's book, and I self-published it, in part because I was used to being a spoken word artist and kind of, self-publishing my own poetry work, and I was used to mounting shows. Like, basically, I was used to DIY and you make it happen. And the process of waiting for an agent so that my agent could try and sell the book just was making me nuts. So I was like, I'm doing a book, I'm doing it now. So I did. And, I was like a working mom with a small child trying to query, and I didn't have a lot of time. And so I went with Create Space, which is a division of Amazon. And the reason that I picked them was because before you even spent a dime or did anything, you could call them up and talk to someone on the phone for 2 hours for free, right? And I needed that kind of technical assistance because I didn't know how to self-publish a book. So there was a lot of help available. But the thing I'll say is that the downside is that because of some of the things we were talking about before, independent bookstores are basically boycotting Amazon and won't work with them. So what that meant was that I had set everything up through Create Space. So the audience that I've developed for this particular book, it's called Puffy, People Whose Hair Defies Gravity, and it's about people with puffy hair. And I developed it, particularly for people of African heritage and others with puffy hair to feel good about themselves. It's like a kid's book with little rhyming text. Anyway, so I built some audience for it, and it sells and people go there, but there really isn't distribution because of that. Because the independent bookstores are, it's not in their interest to support Amazon. And, when I get the time, I will also put it on Lightning Source or Ingram so that it can be distributed by another distributor that independent bookstores will work with, because people ask me hey, can I get your book in the bookstore? And they can't. I mean, fortunately, I have good relationships with Bay Area librarians, so the book has been distributed into libraries and got reviewed by School Library Journal. But so as a self-published author on what was very much a side project, it had a lot of potential, but there were a lot of pitfalls that I learned about in that process.
Hi, Dr. Kat Schreier, Web Tribe Guide. I work with a number of coaches, personal development leaders, and whatnot. Will often take a book as a way of sort of organizing their system, get that out there, and then it becomes a starting off point for a course. We can program things like that. Now, not quite as easy to do that with fiction, but even just having that book, providing opportunities for speaking and whatnot. Have you looked at, or have any of you had experience with the book leading to other revenue streams or leveraging off the book into a course, workshop, speaking opportunities?
Absolutely, a book can be a platform builder. And a platform can be a book builder. So those two things really feed into each other. A lot of book contracts include language allowing that cross-pollination because it's so important for both to be able to kind of use that content for courses and workshops and speeches as well as for the book itself. I think it all depends on kind of the content and the plan for the book. If there's a big enough idea, the book could potentially be the jumping off point for the publisher to help that book build additional brands and additional engagements for an author. Random House also has the Random House Speakers Bureau, which will get speaking engagements for authors. It's a different business financially, but it shares the same name. At the same time, oftentimes the workshop comes first and the book follows. Kind of the workshop will prove an organic audience for that content. Oftentimes an author will kind of self-publish a packet or a workbook. I also edit What Color's Your Parachute, and it's a career book wherein it started out as a pamphlet for ministers that the author had, and it kind of grew into a much bigger thing. And so it can go both ways.
I do think, after, and this comes back into the whole platform discussion we were having, that for me, I think I've gotten many more, my book may have gotten, or I'm almost certain it probably got more attention because I was a columnist. So that makes me more attractive when I'm speaking, when I'm invited to speak at a festival or to speak at a university. It's just one more thing, because in terms of having a book, you know, no institution or festival is going to have you because they want you there because you want to sell books. That's your goal. That's not their goal. So what is it that you can say and bring to it that's about the cultural, you know, about the discussion that's out there, whether it's around diversity or whatever topic area the book is around? It has to be worth their while to have you come in. It can't just be about like, oh, look, I have a book.